morning of July 14th, 1789, a Parisian mob of some 8,000 men and women in search of weapons streamed toward the Bastille, a royal armory filled with arms and ammunition. The Bastille was also a state prison, although it contained only 7 prisoners at the time. In the eyes of those angry Parisians, it was a glaring symbol of the government's harsh policies. The armory was defended by the Marquis de Launay, a small garrison of 114 men. The assault began at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, when a group of attackers managed to lower 2 drawbridges over the moat surrounding the fortress. The mob was joined by members of the French Guard, who began to bombard the fortress with cannonballs. After 4 hours of fighting, 98 attackers lay dead or dying. Only 1 defender had been killed. As more attackers arrived, Delaunay realized that he and his troops could not hold out much longer and surrendered. Angered by the loss of its members, the victorious mob beat Delaunay to death, cut off his head, and carried it aloft in triumph through the streets of Paris. When King Louis XVI returned to his palace at Versailles after a day of hunting, he was told about the fall of Bastille by Duc de la Rochemaille-Linacourt. Louis exclaimed, "Why, this is a revolt." "No, sire," replied the Duke. "It is a revolution." Background to the Revolution. The year 1789 witnessed 2 far-reaching events: the beginning of a new United States of America and the beginning of the French Revolution. Compared with the American Revolution, the French Revolution was more complex, more violent, and far more radical. It tried to create both a new political order and a new social order. Indeed, it has often been seen as a major turning point in European political and social history. The causes of the French Revolution include both long-range problems and immediate forces. The long-range problems are to be found in the condition of French society. Before the Revolution, French society was based on inequality. France's population of 27 million was divided, as it had been since the Middle Ages, into 3 orders, also known as estates. The first estate consisted of the clergy and numbered about 130,000 people. These people owned approximately 10% of the land. They were exempt from France's chief tax. The clergy were radically divided. The higher clergy, members of the aristocratic families, shared the interests of the nobility. The parish priests were often poor and from the class of commoners. The second estate, the nobility, included about 350,000 people. Nobles owned about 25 to 30% of the land. They played an important and even a crucial role in French society in the 18th century. They held many of the leading positions in the government, the military, the law courts, and the higher church offices. Moreover, they possessed many privileges, including tax exemptions. They also sought to keep their control over positions in the military, the church, and the government. The Third Estate, or the commoners of society, made up the overwhelming majority of the French population. Unlike the First and Second Estates, the Third Estate was divided by vast differences in occupation, level of education, and wealth. The peasants, who made up 75 to 80% of the total population, were by far the largest segment of the Third Estate. As a group, they owned about 35 to 40% of the land. However, land holdings varied from area to area, and over half of the peasants had little or no land on which to survive. Serfdom no longer existed on any large scale in France, but French peasants still had obligations to their local landlords that they deeply resented. These relics of feudalism were obligations that survived from an earlier age. They included the payment of fees for the use of village facilities such as the flour mill, community oven, and wine press, as well as contributions to the clergy. Another part of the Third Estate consisted of skilled craftspeople, shopkeepers, and other wage earners in the city. In the 18th century, a rise in consumer prices that was greater than the increase in wages left these urban groups with a decline in buying power. The struggle for survival led many of these people to play an important role in the revolution, especially in Paris. The middle class was another part of the Third Estate. This group included about 8% of the population, or 2.3 million people. They owned about 20 to 25% of the land. This group included merchants, bankers, and industrialists, as well as professional people such as lawyers, holders of public offices, doctors, and writers. Members of the middle class were unhappy with the privileges held by the nobles. At the same time, they shared a great deal with the nobility. Indeed, by obtaining public offices, wealthy middle-class individuals could enter the ranks of the nobility. During the 18th century, over 6,500 new noble families were created. In addition, both aristocrats and members of the middle class were drawn to the new political ideas of the Enlightenment. Both groups were increasingly upset with a monarchical system resting on privileges and on old and rigid social orders. The opposition of these elites to the old order ultimately led them to drastic action against the monarchy.